Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So there is a strong preference in the BEAD program for fiber technology, and some folks are complaining that that shouldn't be there, that the NTIA is overstepping what was in the legislation. We'll be talking about that today. I'm going to look at the Notice of Funding Opportunity and see if that's true. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Husey here with Broadband Deployment News. So there was an article that came out here in, this was in Fierce Telecom. It says Tennessee senators push back on NTIA fiber preference ahead of oversight hearing. This is Senators Marsha Blackburn and Bill Hagerty of Tennessee. They pressed the NTIA to reconsider its decision to prioritize broadband funding for fiber projects, arguing this could negatively impact rural areas. In a letter to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and NTIA Chief Alan Davidson, Blackburn and Hagerty said the recently announced decision to prioritize fiber makes no sense for many areas of rural America, noting some remote topography makes fiber rollouts virtually impossible. They added the NTIA's preference flies in the face of what Congress intended when it allocated $65 billion for broadband deployments in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So it's a couple of statements in there that are not really true. And I'll go through the NOFO, the important parts, and talk about why that's the case. But if you look at the act, there is a preference for fiber. The mic is kind of hot here. There is a preference for fiber, and there is basically leeway for states to apply other kinds of technology. So we'll talk about that. Noting in the text. Nothing in the text suggests that Congress intended for NTIA to preference fiber at the expense of fixed wireless, mobile wireless, satellite, or other viable technologies, they wrote. And again, I don't think that's necessarily true. So the pair pointed out that broadband maps released by the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development in April show that fixed wireless and mobile wireless have a strong presence in their state, while there's no fiber in hard-to-serve areas at all. Expanding access to fixed wireless and mobile technology rather than prioritizing fiber would more quickly and cost-effectively close the digital divide. And I think it's true to say that certain technologies are going to be more cost-effective. Certainly, mobile is not something that they wanted to rely on. They really want this to be wired broadband. Fixed wireless is different. I shouldn't say wired broadband. Fixed wireless is different, let's say, than just a mobile service that you get on your phone. They wanted to make sure, we saw this in the pandemic, a lot of people had mobile service, and they realized that was not sufficient when suddenly their kids were at home having to do homework and they were at home having to do work remotely. So they really do want this to be a home or business kind of broadband product. Fixed wireless does meet that in that you are not just relying on your phone. We could be talking about 5G service, that kind of thing. Again, I don't think that, I think there are plenty of answers here from the NTIA that they will come back that will answer these concerns of theirs, and I'll talk about that. So New Street research analyst Blair Levin told Fierce last month that one of the reasons the NTIA may have prioritized fiber is that the multi-billion-dollar investment is not a once-in-a-decade thing, but more of a one-and-done funding effort. Thus, those in charge of allocating the funds want to ensure that they contribute to the deployment of the most future-proof technology, unless there really is no other alternative. And that really is what the NTIA is going for here, is that we really want fiber to be where you go with this, unless there's no other alternative, and they do leave openings for that. NTIA Chief Davidson has said that even though it wants to prioritize fiber, the agency fully expects satellite and other non-fiber technologies will receive plenty of funding, particularly in high-cost areas that might otherwise go unserved. On the overbuild issue, he said NTIA will insist funding is not used in areas where other government money has already been awarded. And they've also said, so they're saying there, and that is in the Act and it's in the NOFO, that if there's already government money that's been committed, that's being used or been committed to a particular area, then let's say an area that's unserved, it won't be unserved. So on the broadband maps, that should be taken off of the maps. If money's been committed, let's say through RDOF or some other federal program, then they're not going to overbuild there. They also have said that the goal of this program is to have every single unserved and underserved area in the country covered before they ever consider overbuilding for other reasons. In other words, for competitive reasons, to try to bring pricing down. So if there is a service provider in an area that's already providing something over 100 by 20, there's no intention to provide broadband funds in that area prior to all other areas in the country that are unserved or underserved being covered. Now, I suppose some of that will depend on whether that is a truly reliable broadband service or not, but I would think certainly the major goal, the primary goal, is unserved and underserved first. So let's take a look at the NOFO. I got some slides here that I was going to go through that just kind of picked on some key parts of this. I think, yeah, so this is, first off, this is kind of a definition further down in the document where it defines Priority Broadband Project, and it's a little bit more detailed than the definition at the top, and I was going to show both of them. So this is a little further down in the document. It says the Infrastructure Act, and it's talking specifically here about how the Infrastructure Act defines this. So this is what's in the actual act. This is not the notice of funding opportunity that the senators are complaining about, that has all of the rules and that wrap around this, but this is from the actual act. It provides that a priority broadband project is one designed to, number one, provide broadband service that meets speed, latency, reliability, consistency, and quality of service and related criteria as the Assistant Secretary shall determine. So Alan Davidson, Assistant Secretary, has the leeway to determine other things, so he's within his purview to do that. And number two, ensure that the network built by the project can easily scale speeds over time to meet the evolving connectivity needs of households and businesses and support the deployment of 5G successor wireless technologies and other advanced services. NTIA is determined, so here's where NTIA comes in. It says, okay, this is what the Act said, now here's how we determine, or how we interpret that. NTIA has determined that priority broadband projects are those that use end-to-end fiber optic architecture. Only end-to-end fiber will ensure that the network built by the project can easily scale speeds over time to meet the evolving connectivity needs of households and businesses and support the deployment of 5G successor wireless technologies and other advanced services. So he's saying fiber is what fits what they defined in the Act. End-to-end fiber networks can be updated by replacing equipment attached to the ends of the fiber optic facilities, allowing for quick and relatively inexpensive network scaling as compared to other technologies. Moreover, new fiber deployments will facilitate the deployment and growth of 5G and other advanced wireless services, which rely extensively on fiber for essential backhaul. And that's true. As you see, even 5G operators that are deploying their 5G throughout different areas, they still have fiber backhaul to be able to carry all of that back to a central location. Now, this is the definition at the beginning of the NOFO. It says Priority Broadband Project. So we just saw how they came about to say that fiber is what is going to be primarily used there. It says Priority Broadband Project. The term Priority Broadband Project means a project that will provision service via end-to-end fiber optic facilities to each end user premises. So really what I meant to say is fiber is the only thing that qualifies as a Priority Broadband Project. An eligible entity may disqualify any project that might otherwise qualify as a Priority Broadband Project from Priority Broadband Project status with the approval of the Assistant Secretary on the basis that that location surpasses the eligible entity's extremely high cost per location threshold, as described in Section 4B7 below, or for other valid reasons subject to approval by the Assistant Secretary. So there is this caveat that if it is a very extremely high cost area, as the article was saying, we're going to be leaving out these areas that are very high cost or hard to reach. Well, here there's a caveat about this specifically. So what is this extremely high cost per location? Extremely high cost per location threshold, again, this is right from the NOFO. An extremely high cost per location threshold is a BEAD subsidy cost per location to be utilized during the subgrantee selection process described in Section 4B7 of this NOFO above, which an eligible entity may decline to select a proposal if use of an alternative technology meeting the BEAD program's technical requirements would be less expensive. That sounds, as you first look at that, it sounds like, oh, well, they could just say, well, fixed wireless is less expensive, we're going to use that. Or satellite's less expensive, we're going to use that. But there's this it's further defined down here in the note, number 6. Each eligible entity must establish its extremely high cost per location threshold in a manner that maximizes use of the best available technology while ensuring that the program can meet the prioritization and scoring requirements set forth in Section 4B6B of this NOFO. NTIA expects eligible entities to set the extremely high cost per location threshold as high as possible to help ensure that end-to-end fiber projects are deployed wherever feasible. NTI looks forward to working with each eligible entity to help develop an appropriate, extremely high cost per location threshold. So in other words, they're giving them that caveat that you can look at other technologies if they're extremely high cost, but we want to make sure that that threshold is very high so that fiber is used in most every situation if at all possible. And by the way, we also will consult with you, or we will work with you, and they may even have some approval process where we will approve what that threshold is. It doesn't necessarily say that, but it does say they look forward to working with each eligible entity to help develop an appropriate threshold. And then there's this section, selection among competing proposals for the same location or location. So if the eligible entity, and anytime I'm saying that, I'm saying state, because these are all states or territories that are getting this money that then will subgrant it out, right? So selection among competing proposals for the same location or locations, a state process in selecting subgrantees for last mile broadband deployment projects must first assess which locations or sets of locations under consideration are subject to one or more proposals that, number one, constitute priority broadband projects. That's their number one priority. And number two, satisfy all other requirements set out in this NOFO with respect to subgrantees. And there's a whole list of those other things. In the event that there is just one proposed priority broadband project in a location or set of locations, and that the proposal does not exceed the eligible entity's extremely high cost per location threshold, that proposal is the default winner, unless the state requests and the Assistant Secretary grants a waiver allowing the state to select an alternative project. To the extent that there are multiple proposals in a location or set of locations that constitute a priority broadband project and satisfy all the other requirements, the state can then use its approved, or shall use its approved competitive process to select a project subject to the selection criteria set forth below. And then there's all of those criteria. So what it's saying here is if they've got just one proposal and it is a priority broadband project, meaning it's a fiber project, and it doesn't exceed that threshold, then they are to go ahead and just choose that. They don't need to seek out any other proposals, although it does say that they can. The state could request and the secretary could grant a waiver allowing them to select an alternative project for some reason. So they need to, so again, there's a little bit of leeway there. And then if there are multiple proposals that are all priority broadband projects, then they have to look at those based on the selection, the other kinds of criteria, and there's criteria like which is going to cost more to the state. In other words, which is one proposal offering a higher match. Let's say one proposal is a 25% match, which is the minimum, and another one's offering a 40% match. So they would probably then, through this competitive process, score it with that plus the other things, and might most likely pick the one with the 40% match. So here talks about selection among other last mile broadband deployment projects. So with respect to locations or sets of locations for which the eligible entity did not receive a proposal to deploy priority broadband projects, so no fiber projects were proposed, the state shall first identify any locations with only one proposal that satisfies all of the other requirements with respect to subgrantees. In those locations or sets of locations, the entity submitting the sole proposal is a default winner, again, unless the state requests and the Assistant Secretary grants a waiver allowing them to seek other potential subgrantees. To the extent there are multiple proposals seeking to serve a location, and again, these would be non-fiber, same thing, the entity shall, or the state shall undertake its competitive process to choose between among those proposals, again, based on the other criteria. Now here in this section, it's form and content of the initial proposal. So they're talking about what the initial proposal from the state is going to look like. And I'm going to skip most of these and just go to number 8, which I thought was relevant to this question. So NTI will provide eligible entities with an online template for submission of the initial proposal. An eligible entity, a state may submit only a single initial proposal. The initial proposal must at a minimum, and then again, skipping from 1 to 8, at a minimum include a detailed plan to competitively award subgrants. So again, they need to have a plan for how they're going to pick and choose between competing proposals. With respect to last mile broadband deployment projects, the plan must explain how the eligible entity will ensure timely deployment of broadband and minimize the BEAD subsidy required to serve consumers. So again, this is, some of this has to do with the match, because obviously the higher the match from the service provider, then the further those funds will go. Initial proposal must include identification or a detailed process for identifying an extremely high cost per location threshold. So they need to talk about how they need to define that and how they came up with that. To be utilized during the subgrantee selection process. Each eligible entity must establish its extremely high cost per location threshold in a manner that maximizes the use of the best available technology while ensuring that the program can meet the prioritization and scoring requirements set forth in section blah, blah, blah of this NOFO. NTIA expects eligible entities to set the extremely high cost per location threshold as high as possible to help ensure that end-to-end fiber projects are deployed wherever feasible. So yes, fiber is definitely, the thumb is definitely on the scale for fiber. They want the states to, again, set these thresholds so that fiber is probably the way it's going to go, unless, as the senators were pointing out, there are some really hard to reach areas where maybe right now the only feasible service is wireless, for example, or satellite even. Now, what about that? Did it mention it here? No, but I thought I had something on reliable. Yeah, I do. So here's what we know from the NOFO. So I'll explain if I don't have anything on this. So fiber is the preferred technology for broadband deployment using BEAD funds. That's true. These proposals are to have priority over those in most cases. States can set their extremely high cost threshold for projects where the cost to deploy fiber is considered too expensive. This is to be set as high as possible. And the NTIA sounds like they're going to have input on that. And I don't know if that's going to be, I suppose a state could talk to someone at the NTIA and say, hey, we're trying to develop this, where does it need to be? Or the state can come up with it, but it's going to be in the initial proposal, and then the NTIA is certainly going to be looking at that and may have feedback. Technology that provides reliable broadband service is required unless not possible. That is, and that what reliable broadband service is defined as in this NOFO is fiber, cable modem, or DSL, or terrestrial fixed wireless using entirely licensed spectrum or a hybrid of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So that right there takes out satellite, and it takes out fixed wireless if it's all unlicensed spectrum. But there's still an opportunity for even using all unlicensed spectrum or satellite, as we saw in the NOFO. So it says, so here, fixed wireless using all unlicensed spectrum or satellite may be funded if there are no options that meet the reliable broadband service as defined above. And I thought, where was that? Was that in here? Maybe I didn't snip out that little part of the NOFO, but basically what it's saying is if you don't have reliable broadband, if you don't have something that qualifies as reliable broadband service, that is going to, if that's going to be too expensive, then you can use something like satellite, or you could use completely unlicensed spectrum throughout that. So if you're at the top of a mountain and you have somebody that's not going, that can't afford licensed spectrum, but they can do this with unlicensed spectrum, maybe CBRS or something like that, that provides, that reaches the other qualifications, such as something that's over 100 by 20, then that can be used. But again, that's kind of a last resort kind of thing. So you've got fiber as your first priority. Then it needs to be, if it's not fiber, it's some other reliable broadband service, such as cable modem, DSL, and or fixed wireless with either licensed spectrum or a mix of licensed and unlicensed. And then the last resort would be something that is, let's say, what they don't consider reliable broadband service, and that would be the only things that could encompass would be unlicensed spectrum completely and satellite. Now, so those could be funded. Now, how they fund satellite, I don't know, because the satellites are up there. They belong to whoever, like Elon Musk or OneWeb or whoever's going to be providing that service. So the only thing I can think of is that they would provide, they would pay for the terminal, which is kind of expensive, about $500 for that little terminal that sits on your house that gets the low Earth orbit satellite signal. Or maybe there's some way that they provide a subsidy for the monthly costs, although actually if Starlink were to get any funding through this, they have to agree that they would provide a low-cost option. Every single service provider that's going to do this has to provide a low-cost option, which means Starlink may need to come out with a plan for some amount, $30, $50 a month or something like that, to be maybe on par with some of these other low-cost options. So I don't know how that's going to work, but it is something that is possible through this. So So I think that I understand the senator's concerns, being in a state like Tennessee, lots of mountainous areas and some other areas, rural areas where it's kind of hard to deploy fiber, maybe not many customers per mile. But there are provisions in this. So again, what the NTIA is trying to do is balance the need for future-proofing technology, because again, this could be once and done. So each state's going to get a bunch of money, and then they want to use that as efficiently as possible. And that means, but also provide future-proof technology. So that means putting fiber in the ground wherever possible so that it's something that can easily scale up. It can, again, be used for 5G infrastructure, that kind of thing, backhaul. But there are the provisions for very high-cost areas to be able to do something else, to be able to get that deployed more quickly, less expensively, because, again, we want to make sure that everybody gets covered. And if, putting fiber, if a state has to put fiber out in areas where they're going to use up a lot of their funds and not be able to cover everybody, they don't want to do that. So this is going to be a give and take. The NTIA is going to grant waivers in certain cases. They're going to allow, they already allow for this, these different ways of doing things. So I think the senators, I think their complaints are really already addressed and handled. I think maybe their point is to just bring this to the forefront and maybe, even though it's already in there, to maybe have the NTIA be a little bit more forgiving on the high cost stuff, to maybe not be so strict on the extremely high cost thresholds, to keep that down, and then also to maybe be more willing to work with the states as they try to figure out the lay of the land and how they're going to make this all happen, how they're going to cover everybody in their state. Especially in states that have very hard to reach areas and maybe very rural, spread out populations. So thanks for joining me. If this was helpful, go ahead and give me a like on the video. I'd appreciate that. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Click the little button in YouTube or down in the right corner of the video screen. You can click there and subscribe, and then click the bell and be notified when I'm live. Thanks a lot, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.